Chapter 11. Somme. John Hamman, 21, 1916. Front lines, France. There wasn't enough air. There never seemed to be enough air. Too many men packed into too small of a space. They said the big shells sucked all of the oxygen out of the air. He didn't know about that, but far too many men were packed like sardines into the bunker. Even men with no hint of claustrophobia could lose it in here. You didn't hear the big shells landing outside. You felt them as dirt sifted down through the boards of the ceiling. It was something beyond sound, as the air and your whole body was compressed with the concussion. Men went insane at the mere idea of one of those landing directly on the bunker. They had had to strangle a man last week. They had killed one of their own. No one spoke of it. It drove them all a little mad. Perhaps it was meant to. By the time the barrage lifted, they would be ready to pour from the bunker simply to taste the air again. They would flood out and up and over the trench line toward the enemy to escape the bunker. Their officer stood by the oil lamp at the front of the bunker, looking at his watch. John didn't know if the time had come or if his time had run out. All he knew was he had to get out of this bunker, even if it meant he would die, as long as it was in the open air. He couldn't really look down in the dark and press of the bunker, but he could feel the gas mask container on his belt, the pockets of ammunition, the bayonet, his canteen. The lieutenant was staring at his watch. He lifted the whistle from around his neck and brought it to his lips. The sound was loud in the confines of the bunker. It was time. The bar slid back, and they poured out along the trench. He could see men flooding from other dugouts along the line, out into the night air. So many star shells were bursting above them that it might as well have been day. Why bother attacking at night? The light of the flares cast eerie shadows from the barbed wire and filled the scene with an otherworldly light. "Fix bayonets!" The command echoed all along the line. They all gathered under the berm. Beyond it was no man's land and the death that awaited them with an 8mm bullet. The whistle was loud, but John didn't hear it over the roar of the men, the roar that was emanating from his own throat. The scramble up and over the trench line into a wall of machine gun fire, cutting down the men to his left as it walked across their line, and then he was tumbling forward into the mud below the berm and line of tracers. He remembered charging forward over the broken ground, pitted with more craters than the surface of the moon. Bullets cracked around him as another man fell on his right. Artillery shells were landing, raising great fountains of dirt into the air, leaving behind fresh craters on top of the ones already there. Artillery rounds burst above their heads as hot shrapnel cut into the ground all around them. A human wave rolled forth, stumbling, clawing, crawling across the broken ground through the obstacles of barbed wire and tank traps. Off to his right, he could see one of them. The roar of the engine and grinding of the great tracks could be heard even over the artillery. Its machine gun hammered continuously at the enemy line, and as he watched, one of its side guns fired with a great flash, leaving a ringing in his ears. Sparks flew, and ricochets whined crazily off the beast's armored hide as the Hun's machine guns ineffectively tried to penetrate. He angled to his left, not wanting to be so close to something attracting that much fire. With all the many ways to die this day, the random death from a ricochet seemed most ignominious. He heard a whistling sound, as if the very air was being ripped apart, and the artillery began to fall on them. The concussion knocked the wind from his lungs. Dirt rained down on him, and he crawled forward, his rifle lost as he blindly tried to get away when he crawled over a ridge and fell headfirst down a steep slope into a large crater. He landed with a sodden splash at the bottom in stinking rancid water. He came up gagging and swam toward the side, clawing his way through the mud, out of the water, up onto the forward slope. He tried to wipe his eyes, but his arm was covered with mud. Dead, bloated bodies floated in the water. The smell was overpowering. The natural urge to vomit was only abated after several involuntary dry heaves were beaten back by his desire to survive this night. Another shell landed off to his left, with a huge roar, and more dirt rained down on him. Part of the side of the crater seemed to collapse, threatening to bury him. Tracers streaked overhead. The water was cold, and he was not sure how he could get out of the crater. The slippery, near-vertical walls were like a trap. Another star shell burst overhead, and looking around, he realized he was not alone. Someone else was in the crater with him. The man was on his belly as if he had slid back down from his own efforts to climb from the crater. John's bayonet was gone with his rifle. He pulled his knife from the sheath in the back of his belt. It had been his grandfather's, and the stories said he had fought off Indians with it. Some stories said he had scalped them with it. He bought it in Arkansas on his way to Texas from a blacksmith named James Black, and he'd always sworn it was the finest knife he'd ever owned. The man was not in uniform, at least not one he recognized. He had a helmet on, but it was not English. It was closer to a Hun helmet, and it had something on the front of it. Crawling closer, he rolled the man over and found him to be quite dead. A bullet had struck him in the face. The helmet had a small camera on the front of it. He could see the lens, but it was smaller than any camera he had ever seen. The man had another camera attached to a stick with a loop around his wrist. The clothes he wore were not any uniform John had ever seen. Not the khaki of the British, the grey of the Germans, or even the blue of the French. The best way he could describe them was that of a mottled brown with splotches. He couldn't be sure with all of the mud and the wavering light from the star shells, but he could almost swear the cloth had patterns dyed into it to resemble leaves, or it could be the mud that inexorably covered everything. His helmet was not of any make he knew. It was not made from metal, but something thicker, almost like a pith helmet. He also had something on his chest, like some kind of armor plate. It was thick, but not heavy enough to be metal, or anything that might stop a bullet, with pockets all over it. Who was this man, and what was he doing here in the middle of a war? He wore no insignia, no badges of rank. The only thing on his uniform was a patch, a strangely stylized X, with a clock face in the background on his left shoulder. Scraping some of the mud away, John opened some of the strange pockets on the man's chest. They did not close with buttons, but the flaps pulled up with a ripping sound to reveal a small device, cylindrical, about 8 inches long, with a series of dials around it. It had been grazed by a bullet, cutting a deep groove through the first few dials. It didn't look like a grenade. It didn't have a pin. He twisted some of the dials. They turned, and a red light came on, almost like a tiny electric torch, but shedding little light. The artillery barrage seemed to have passed over him, but then it started over again. This time, he could see them burst in the air in great white clouds. Gas. Nothing was more feared. Dropping the strange device, he reached down to his side and found nothing but tatters. Some piece of shrapnel had torn through the container, spilling out the only thing that could save his life during a gas attack somewhere on the battlefield. He frantically searched the stranger, but he could find nothing resembling a mask. Beyond the edge of the crater, he heard a loud whump. Death in a white cloud rolled over the edge of the crater and down toward him. Then there was a chiming sound, and everything changed. It was over 5 hours later, in the quiet before dawn, when he crawled his way out of no man's land and back to the line. Calling out to the men not to shoot him, he finally dragged himself up over the berm and into his own trenches. The men there could not understand how it was that he was shivering with hypothermia on a warm summer night. The ice in his hair and in his wet clothes was melting quickly in the warm air. The doctor had more difficulty in explaining what appeared to be frostbite on his fingers and toes. He was not the only man to find his way back that morning. All of them would be scarred for the rest of their lives by what they had witnessed, but none of them had seen anything to compare with what John Hamman had experienced over the last few hours.